This episode of vBrownBag 02 Hero API series covers Rubrik. So today we're going to be exploring Rubrik's APIs. My name is Rebecca Fitzhugh, and I am a technical marketing engineer at Rubrik. Feel free to reach out to me via Twitter at Rebecca Fitzhugh or via my blog, technicloud.com. Today we're going to be discussing how Rubrik's APIs can be used to create very powerful and very flexible automation workflows. Workflows that can be, integrated really into any orchestration engine or platform out there that supports outbound REST. First off, I want to point out that the Rubrik platform is designed and built around an API-first architecture. So what this means is any of the features that you see within Rubrik, our engineers and developers have made sure that there is a REST call for that. In fact, the Rubrik UI uses our own REST API. So with every click or action in the user interface, it's actually calling to and consuming our APIs. So the API-first architecture was designed with automation specifically in mind. We're going to see that a little bit today. So apologies for the disruption in the API discussion, but before we really start getting into it, it would behoove us to really just pause and take a step back and discuss Rubrik at a really high level, just in case you are unfamiliar. So let's make this quick and then dig back into automation. Rubrik converges backup software, replication, catalog databases, deduplicated storage, and more into a single software fabric. And that single software fabric can be easily deployed as a plug-and-play appliance, a software appliance, or in the cloud. It really removes that complex or that bloated architecture that's reminiscent of legacy data protection systems, whether it's running on premises or in the cloud. So it's a single software platform that we can use to orchestrate application data from data center to the cloud. We have the ability to do things like instantly power on any application anywhere for recovery, for search, for test dev, whatever purposes I can think of. And since Rubrik is, built on that scale-out architecture that we see with a lot of companies, like Google and Facebook, it allows users to continue managing it as a single system and to scale out very easily without any kind of forklift upgrade. So to get started, installing Rubrik plug-and-play appliances typically takes less than an hour, sometimes 15 minutes. And then once up and running, Rubrik auto-discovers your virtual and physical environments, such as your Hyper-V and ESXi hosts, your VMs, your databases, and it does all of this through APIs, or intelligent connectors. Rubrik uses Flash for fast data extraction, minimizing any kind of performance impact due to that production environment. And ultimately, this results in rapid backup windows, as well as the elimination of any kind of virtual machine stun effect. In addition, we have built an intelligent distributed workflow management system that allows us to maximize the number of parallel data streams that were processed. All of your data gets indexed and efficiently stored in a single scale-out repository with the help of content-aware deduplication. Automation is important, right? So not only do we have our APIs that allow you to automate our system, but we automate within our system already. So we're trying to really reduce any kind of daily operational management, thereby, providing that kind of a step function change in simplicity by enabling a single policy engine that orchestrates your SLAs across the entire data lifecycle. So you can use pre-canned SLAs where you can create and specify your own SLAs, and at which point you're going to select things like your desired snapshot capture frequency, your data retention policy. You're going to select where the data gets stored, whether that's on premises or in the cloud, and then you're going to say all these things, and Rubrik's going to automate that backup execution policy and make sure that that happens for you within that time period that you specify. So with just a single click, users can instantly recover virtual machines, be it Hyper-V or VMware, as well as SQL databases by booting that virtual machine disk file or that SQL file directly on the Rubrik system. So no additional storage provisioning is required because it is a hyperconverged model if you're purchasing one of our plug-and-play appliances. So For VMware, Rubrik becomes an NFS data store from that vSphere perspective. And for Microsoft Hyper-V and for SQL Server, Rubrik serves as a remote data store, and it exposes VM and SQL files via that SMB protocol. Additionally, we do have point-in-time recovery with intelligent log management. So your application and server files can be, really quickly located using our Google-like search and restored to basically any location. We do have end-to-end encryption, and that can be software or hardware-based encryption, and that's available on premises. And if you are sending data to the cloud, it is encrypted in transit as well as at rest. Our data gets stored in an immutable format. That way you can quickly recover from, like a ransomware attack without any kind of data loss. And cloud out. So what we can do is we can send deduped data to the public cloud for long-term retention and still retain that instant access to data using our global Google-like search. So basically all of your data, no matter where it resides, it gets indexed and it's accessible through search. We also have the ability to do cloud on, which is instantiation. So we can instantiate our apps in the public cloud for DR purposes as well as test dev. And basically what happens is Rubrik converts your VM files into a cloud instance. So I mentioned earlier that you can run Rubrik in the public cloud as well. So for any kind of cloud native application, you can deploy Rubrik in your public cloud provider to automate backup, replication, archival, and so on. So now that we have an idea of what Rubrik is, let's do a demo, right? So show you some things in the UI, and then we'll switch to command line. Okay, hello vCenter. All right, so this is our lovely dashboard. So notice on the right-hand side, this is our activity log. So it's showing us the things that are currently ongoing. And then in the center, we have our SLA domains. So this shows us at a really high level what our protection policies look like. And of course, these are just showing us our 3 pre-canned policies, but you have the freedom and ability to create as many SLA domains as you want. And then on the left-hand side on the top, we have basically an overview of our workloads and their protection, right? So in this case, we're looking at vSphere VMs. We see that we have 74 protected and currently 321 not protected. So we go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Let's go and protect those virtual machines. Now, vSphere VMs that's not all we protect. That's not the only type of workload. So you can, of course, drop down here and see all of the different types of workloads that we can protect and then view at a very high level their protection status. Okay, so we also see that we do currently have a live mount, and I'm going to demonstrate doing a live mount in just a minute. We see that right now we're currently not ingesting any snapshots, right, any backups, but we're about to, right? We just saw a bunch of processes kick off. Down at the bottom, okay, we see a little bit about our system. So in this case, we have a single brick with 4 nodes. We can see how many snapshots, or I should say, how much space our snapshots are taking, or how many snapshots is right over here, as well as, how much is currently available from that total, right? And then we can see not only the number of snapshots, but how much data reduction we're experiencing, as well as archive, okay? So in this case, we are currently have about 3.5 terabytes of data that is being currently archived. Now, under SLA domains, we can view our local domains, so things that are local to this particular brick. And we can view all of the ones that have already been created, or we can, of course, create our own. So let's create our own. So let's say VBB and API. Okay, so vBrownBag API series. And at this point, we can go ahead and specify our hourlies, our dailies, our monthlies, our yearlies, and then the retention policy on the right-hand column. So this is effectively, how often do we want to be protecting our data? How often do we want to be backing it up? So we could say, for example, let's do every 2 hours, and we want to keep it for 10 days, okay? And then we want to take a daily and keep it for, say, 30 days, right? Okay. So right now it's saying that our local retention is set to 30 days. Cool. So that means we're going to be retaining 30 days worth of data right here, right locally on this particular brick, okay? Or I should say across this cluster, right? And Down at the bottom, we have our snapshot window where we can specify that window for that protection. So in my opinion, personally, I say don't do it, right? Unless you have a very specific reason to do it, because most of the time that's going to prevent you from actually keeping, meeting that RPO. So if our RPO in this case is 2 hours, a recovery point objective, we're protecting that data every 2 hours, and then I set a window of, say, midnight to 6 a.m. Are we still really protecting our data every 2 hours? Yes, during that window, but overall, no. So if we're not really meeting our RPO 24 hours a day, then are we really meeting our SLA? Right? Now, of course, if your SLA and your RPO specifically, you're like, hey, yeah, once every 24 hours, then yeah, you setting a snapshot, window that's fine, as long as you're meeting it, right? Meeting that SLA, that's very important, because depending on the industry you're in, you could potentially be penalized for not meeting an SLA. With the Rubrik, we do a first full and then forever incremental from that point forward. So by default, it'll take that first full at the first opportunity, but you can choose to schedule that later on, and that'll apply to any machine that gets assigned this policy. And then under our remote settings, okay, so here's where we specify our storage, right, our retention. So again, we specify that we're going to store 30 days. So we see on the right-hand far side, 30 days. Now, 30 days is not very much, and that's probably more than, our configuration is probably more than capable of storing 30 days of data locally. But what if it was set to like 7 years because I have some kind of, crazy retention policy because of some kind of compliance? I may not want to or be able to store that much data on premises, right, or even within this cluster. So I can choose to archive it, and I can archive it to, say, tape. I can archive it to, an NFS server, to an object store, as well as a public cloud. Right, so I can choose here like Google, Amazon, Azure, and I go ahead and configure that beforehand. And then at that point, I go ahead and select my pre-configured archival point. Now at this point, I've said I want to archive to S3. So let's say at that, now I decide I only want to store, let's say, 7 days worth of data on premises in my brick, and then the rest of the data is going to be stored in S3. All right, so we're going to archive for 7 days, all right, and store this data on premises for 7 days, and then we're going to send it out to, in this case, S3, and it's going to be archived for an additional 23 days. Then after that time period expires, right, then it's going to be, of course, rotated out, right, because at that point, the data lifecycle is going to end based off of our policy. Additionally, we can also specify replication. So any, Rubrik instance we can replicate to. So for example, if you have a robo configuration and you have a virtual appliance running Rubrik in that robo site, you can replicate your data into HQ, right? Or, say you have, HQ being protected, and then you have a DR site. You can replicate that HQ data to that DR site. So really, it's going to be Rubrik instance to Rubrik instance replication. So wherever you have Rubrik running. Then at that point, we go ahead and create that policy and then assign it. So we can assign this to our different workloads, right? So if these are, like, for example, virtual machines, we can assign this at a, say, vCenter level, if these are vSphere virtual machines, and have everything within that vCenter auto-inherit it. Or we can be a little bit more granular, right, and apply it on, like, say, a folder level. Or if we really wanted to, we could apply it per virtual machine. All right, so let's cancel out of that. Let's go look at one of my VMs, for example. All right, so I have a couple of VMs. Let's look at my test. Okay, so my test virtual machine is assigned the gold policy, which we see right here, and we see that it is currently residing in our demo vCenter. I have no live mounts of this VM, and I'm currently not doing cloud conversion. I mean, I'm not taking this virtual machine and converting it to, in this case, an AMI in AWS. On the right-hand side, we have a lovely calendar overview. So in this case, we see that we only have 2 blue dots. So for this month of October, we only have 2 days worth of data protection. And we can corroborate that by looking on the left-hand side. So we see the oldest snap was yesterday, the newest snap was just a few hours ago, right? So all of this checks out, right? That makes sense. And we see that we have a total, in this case, of 6 snaps, and we have missed none. So far, so good. But we, of course, only have, at this point, 2 days worth of protection. Now, let's look at today. All right, so you see all different points in time for today. If I hit the ellipses next to the 2:39 p.m. one, we see a couple of options. I can launch on cloud, so I can instantiate this workload into a public cloud provider, namely AWS in this particular instance. I can browse the file, so I can basically crack open that file system and dig through and take a look. I can export this. I can instantly recover. So at that point, if this is still running, the source VM is still running in, say, vCenter, since we know this is a vSphere virtual machine, what's going to happen is that source VM is going to get deprecated, it's going to get taken down, and we're going to bring this up in its place, right? And it's near instant. It's less than a minute before it's up and running, okay? So that's awesome. That retires, right, or deprecates the old one. So, if it's corrupt or it's gone, somebody accidentally deleted it, whatever, I can instantly recover, have it back online in no time. I also have the option to do a mount, right, a live mount. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to basically build a virtual machine out of this snapshot. So out of this point in time, and it's going to run it in parallel to the source virtual machine. So if you do have, say, your source VM still running, you can do a live mount, and this will be appended. It'll be a different name. It'll have a date timestamp, but you can run it in parallel. You can run some tests. You can do any kind of development on it. If you want to just log in and look at what it looks like at that point in time to determine whether you want to roll back to it or not, you can do that. And it's all going to be non-disruptive to the source. And no, at that point, it is going to be running on Rubrik for storage. So if you decide, you're done with it and you want to delete it, you can go ahead and unmount it, and it'll be gone forever. If you decide you want to keep it forever and ever, no problem. You can just simply storage vMotion it back onto your primary storage. So let's go ahead and do that. For example, let's mount it. So at this point, I want to choose an ESXi host. Let's choose ESXi 10. It's going to power it on, and I have the option to remove my virtual network device. So if I am worried about like any kind of IP conflict or name conflict or anything like that, because it is potentially going to go to the same network here, then I can go ahead and choose to remove the network device. So let's do that, and then hit mount. Now, while that's mounting, it should take less than a minute. I want to show you one more thing. I brought up the idea of global search a few times, and so like for example, I have a file called example, right? So notice that it's giving me recommendations based off of what I'm typing at that time, and it does it very, very quickly, right? That's because everything has been indexed. I say very, very quickly, and then of course stops being very, very quick. All right. And at that point, I can choose what version, and I can choose to either say download that onto my local desktop, or I can restore it back in place. All right, cool. So very neat. If I don't want to actually crack open and browse for that file, I can just do a quick search if I know what that file is called. Now, at this point, let's go to live mounts, vSphere VMs. All right, so in that period of time that it took me to search, so a little less than a minute, we see that my virtual machine is up and running. It's the snapshot that it's based off of is today at 2:39 p.m. and it's running on this ESXi host, right, number 10. So if we pop over to our web client, we know and love our vSphere web client, and also do a quick search for my last name, I see my test VM, but then I also see test and then again today's date at 2:39 p.m. Right, so it is running in this case in parallel. And we've removed that NIC, right? So it does tell us whenever we look that, hey, there is no NIC assigned to this VM. And then if I look at the hard disk, then you notice that it is located on Rubrik storage. Okay. So if I decide I want to keep it, no problem, just storage vMotion it over. If I decide I want to remove it, no problem. I can just come right back over here and say, you know what, I'm done with you. Just get rid of it. Unmount. Right, and then it will clean up for me. Okay, so easy breezy. All right, so back to our regularly scheduled API discussion. So let's dig in a little bit more. So Rubrik APIs, they are powerful in that the backup, recovery, and more can be queried, configured, and controlled. So think of all the use cases you can come up with. This idea of repetitious tasks, why, right? Eliminate doing any kind of bulk operation by hand. Extensibility is demonstrated by being able to leverage the Rubrik platform to extend its functionality to, service catalogs such as, say, like vRealize Automation, ServiceNow, and so on and so forth. And as aforementioned, any operation available through the Rubrik UI can be done using the APIs. So everything that I just showed you can be done via the APIs. And Rubrik does use the same RESTful API that you do, and our RESTful APIs, they are native to the platform, and they have been there since day one and are not retrofitted. Now, if I actually pop back over to the demo really quickly. So if I just put in the IP address for the URL and then docs v1, I see our RESTful API documentation, right? So it's all there. So I have a lovely introduction and overview. We have a change log, and it tells you between all the different versions what has changed, and then a nice overview that walks you through things like versioning and authentication and the architecture, right, of our APIs, right? And then as you dig deeper into it, say you can look at SQL Server databases, we really start getting into where it does show, not only the the architecture of it, but it actually starts giving you sample code, right? And talks about how you could use it, and it gives you examples of this, right? And so this is, regardless, we have a masterless architecture, so it doesn't matter what node in the cluster you use. It doesn't matter what IP address you put in here in terms of Rubrik nodes. Just go ahead and put docs v1, and you're going to be able to pull up this documentation. So it's right there, readily available and easy for you. Okay. So, everything is documented using Redoc. So, if you, again, go to any kind of URL endpoint, Rubrik will spit out the documentation for the APIs, and then gives you the ability to essentially look up in minute detail how everything works. And really just by going through and really learning that overview section of the documentation, you would have most of the tools and knowledge required to use our REST interface. And of course, the documentation does provide code snippets and parameters to make it easy for you to learn and to use our APIs. So basically, if you're just now tuning in, TLDR, read the documentation, right? So our API first platform, it can be used to create those workflows that can be integrated into really any engine or service that supports outbound REST. So I used VRA and ServiceNow as an example before, but it's not just them, right? It's things like Puppet, Chef, Ansible, SaltStack, and so on. And if you are using something like ServiceNow, Rubrik does integrate with ServiceNow using a custom app that provides, common backup and recovery workflows that allow help desk teams or even an end user to walk through the items presented in the ServiceNow catalog. So you could do, for example, self-service file level recovery. And that's all, interacting with the Rubrik's APIs. You could initiate a live mount and instantly access your VMs or SQL databases and do that for, recovery or test dev. You can even pull in Rubrik information into your dashboard and reporting. And if you are using something like ServiceNow, then ultimately this does give you a little bit of a higher level of self-service that is ITIL compliant, and it already aligns with whatever your existing business rule is. So basically what I'm trying to say at this point is that the sky's the limit when it comes to use cases. Use your imagination and create something interesting. Rubrik already has a bunch of stuff on GitHub. Help us add to it. So let's dig into the architecture. The way that our API architecture looks like is that we are using the Open API spec, right, or specification that was formerly known as Swagger, hence like the cool dude walking on the last slide. I don't have the heart to change it from Swagger to Open API on that slide. It's just, I like the animation. So the Open API specification, it's the most widely adopted API spec in the industry. So that's important to point out because the nice thing about this is that a lot of companies are using it. We're not the only one. So companies like VMware, PayPal, and so on, they're all using it. And so by using Open API spec, it ensures that we can leverage the best practices in the industry, and build a truly scalable and easy to use API. But what that also really means, it's probably a little bit more important to you, is that you can use all the open source tools that are out there to generate code and SDKs, and you can interface really in the language of your choice. And a lot of people are doing this, so there's a lot of tooling around this already. You know, a lot of open source tools. So if you generate code or SDKs, it makes it pretty easy. So really the main idea is that if you use the Rubrik UI or you want to interface with our APIs using your favorite scripting language, you can. You have access to the same thing either way. Really the same sort of logic applies regardless. Rubrik APIs, they are resource centric, and everything is organized by resource types. So for example, VMware, Microsoft SQL, file sets, Hyper-V, and more. And more endpoints are added with every release. Now, again, we have a bunch of endpoints, but we've made sure that everything is well documented and it does adhere to a common interface. And not only do we have this RESTful API, but we've already built a few modules of tooling around it. So we have, for example, our PowerShell module, and you can find that on our GitHub page. So if you want to interact with our product using only PowerShell, that's totally possible. We also have a module for vRealize Orchestrator, and then of course we already mentioned things like ServiceNow. So using VRO, as a specific example here, you would go to our GitHub page. You can download the VRO package, install it on your Orchestrator server, and then essentially what you can do is give a service catalog to an end user. So the user requests a new service or virtual machine, and then as a part of that request, the user can select which Rubrik SLA to apply to it. And so at that point, the user can really kind of control what the cost would be for backup, whether you're protecting it, say, every hour or every, say, 24 hours. And if you don't do that, if you've already, say, applied an SLA to the vCenter level or the folder level, that's fine. Rubrik will detect that the VM has been placed there and assign it an SLA anyway, right, based off of where it's located. And so it's fairly automated in that sense. Additionally, once that VM has been provisioned, you can do VM and file level restores, live mounts, whatever you want through VRA. So let's see an example of Rubrik APIs in action. All right, so in this example, we're going to go through a workflow that validates our Rubrik backups. So in just a second, I'm going to switch screens to my demo. So the idea is if I could do automated testing of my backups, right? That's kind of an important idea. It's great that I've backed up my data and it's there, but is it actually even usable, right? So it'd be pretty cool if I could have some kind of automated testing of my backups without having to trigger something manually. So let me switch screens and then I'm going to execute this demo script and then we'll walk through what's happening. So this is a pipeline job using something we built using a framework called Invoke Build that uses PowerShell. So the code is specifying at this point to go ahead, and connect to the various APIs. So in this case, the Rubrik API, as well as in vSphere, right? We want to connect to vCenter. So every time a backup is taken, the script is going to get triggered. And what it's going to do is it's going to live mount a virtual machine. And we see that actually happening right now. And it's called two-tier app. So it's actually made up of an application server and a database. So right now I'm just saying, hey API, can you make a live mount of these two workloads, right? So the next part that we're going through is, hey, great, we've live mounted them, but are they up, right? So what is the power state, right? Are they on? Are they off? So we see that they are on. Cool. Now, great, they're on, but is the operating system responding? Well, let's check VMware Tools status, right? So we're waiting. Is VMware Tools running? Okay, so it looks like it's running on the application server, but not the DB yet. So again, let's try again. What's going on with that? Now, cool. So we validated that the guest tools is running. Now, we've also coded and said, I want you to do some fancy stuff. Now, you could just test it straight away at this point, but we've had customers ask if we can do things like change IP addresses and other specifications, and we can. So I'm moving it to a different VLAN, and this one's called VLAN 50 servers mount, right? So we see that we are moving it to the different network. So we put that virtual machine, both of these virtual machines, into that environment. Okay. Waiting on it to keep running. What we're also going to do to make it a little bit more complex is we're also going to change the IP address of those virtual machines. Cool. So we see that our application server got at 172.17.50.121, and I'm being called out for having an old version of VMware Tools on my database server. Sorry, I'm a slacker. Hopefully it'll get past that. So either way, it should get a new IP address. All right, so we've got 121, and our database should be 122. Right? Now keep in mind that some applications really hate for their IP address to be changed, so don't do that. You can test it a different way. Right? Okay, so we have new IP addresses, and now we're going to run some tests. So what we're doing here is we're actually doing a ping test, and then we're also doing net logon. So net logon tells me for this Windows server, I get some basic information about whether the partitions are corrupted, whether the operating system came up, whether the services are running. So that went by really quickly, right? So now it's done, and our code, at the very end, saying, "Give me some information and tell me what happened." So one thing to kind of point out here is, notice at the top in green it says 2 minutes and 47 seconds. So that's pretty fast. So it's reporting that in 2 minutes and 47 seconds, we brought up a 2-tier application from backup, moved it to a new network, connected the NICs, gave it a new IP address, ran these 2 tests, validated that those VMs did come up from that backup with a new IP on a new network. We're able to ping it. We're able to check net logon. And then at the end, we said, you know what? Cool, we're done. We validated if it works. Get rid of everything. I told Rubrik, I'm good. Throw it all away. Right? So all of this is backup validation, and all of this is done by invoking, the Rubrik API as well as vSphere. Right? So how does this work, right? So it seems like magic, right? But really, in order to do automation these days, all you really need is a solid API and the ability to write minimal amounts of codes, right? And I would by no means say that I am wildly proficient. I would never, look for a job as a software engineer, right? So I can write minimal amounts of code. So the first thing we're looking at here is a JSON, right? So this is really just kind of our configuration. We use JSON in this example, but really you could use whatever you want that's applicable. So I really need to tell any kind of system what my application looks like, what my environment looks like, and what you want me to test. So that being said, here's what my application looks like. It's the name of the workload I'm running. So in this case, that same VM that we saw me messing with earlier, SE or Fitzhugh test. That's the name. And here's what I want to call it once it's mounted. So mount 2-tier app. Cool. And then here are my credentials, right? So my guest credentials are stored in an XML file, right? So a secure XML. And then I also specify, here's what I want the new IP address to be. Here's what network I want to connect it to, and here's the gateway, and we want to run some tests, right? And that's ping and net logon. And I did this for the application server as well as the database. So ultimately, this JSON file, it's really just, the configuration of the app. Now, I also have a second JSON file. Okay. So here, I have to tell my environment, or I have to tell it where my environment is, right? So great, I have an idea of what my application looks like, but where's my environment? So in this case, here's my IP addresses for Rubrik. Here's my IP address for vCenter, and I need to authenticate with it. So here are my credentials. So in this case, I have my secure XML credentials for vSphere and Rubrik. So you just take, a user account or, a service account and put those credentials into a secure object and save it as an XML. Cool. So now I have the configuration of the application and I have access to the environments to test in. The next thing is I have to say what tests I want to run. So here I have ping and net logon because, really they're easy. Everybody knows these. Everybody gets these. So here I have ping, right? So test ping, and I'm going to assert that whenever we do this test connection that it's true. Okay. So test connection here is it's really going to send that ping, and then quiet is going to be for us to tell us true or false. And if not, go ahead and send us back this error. And then net logon is going to get the credentials. Okay, great. So we've got our credentials, and then it's going to call the WMI for this particular environment. And we want to also make sure that the service that we're calling, in this case, net logon, is running, right? So the state should be, in this case, running. Okay, so really nothing too crazy about this so far as as the code itself goes. And then to piecemeal this all together, we have our build, right? So this is the PowerShell script that puts it together, right? So starting at the beginning, right, we want to pull all of our configuration details from those JSONs. So we want to know the environment file, we want to know the configuration file. Of course, we want to connect to Rubrik, we want to connect to VMware, and we're going to do that, of course, by using that credential file that we have. And then we're going to do a live mount. So we're going to do the live mount of those two virtual machines. We're going to validate that that live mount works. And we're going to do that by checking the power state, as well as checking the health of VMware tools, right? So we want to know that the guest tools are running, just like we want to know that we are powered on, right, if it succeeds. We wanted to make this one a little bit more complex, because at that point we could have said, okay, great, we have the live mounts, the virtual machines are running, there is, the VMware tools are running, let's just ping, right? Let's just check net logon at that point. But we made it a little bit more complicated. So the next thing was moving the live mounts to a test network, right? So we want to go ahead and specify, we're going to set that adapter to a new network, right? And so we specified that network name in our configuration, right, in that JSON. And then we're going to change the IP address. So we're going to set that IP address to the IP address specified in that JSON file. And then at that point, we're going to run some tests, right? And those tests are going to be ping and net logon, right? And that's going to use that test PowerShell script, right? And at the very end, when we're done, get rid of all of it and then report back to us, okay? All right, so now let me switch back to my slides. So we've gone on this magical journey through space and time together. I just want to state that that exact code that we just ran through is available on GitHub, right? Clicking the wrong thing. Here we go. All right, so the reason we weren't really able to do this before is, because unfortunately in the world of data center operations, APIs have been few and far between. Many, applications and products required you to log into a console and then learn some kind of SDK, or won't even give you an API at all. Instead, require you and force you to go through the GUI. Right? That to me is a little bit crazy. So you need something that's smart, has an API, and does your bidding. All right. So in previous vBrownBag API episodes, we talked about imperative versus declarative. So imperative is where you have to be smarter than the computer and tell it what to do. Do this, go there, build this, whatever. Whereas a declarative model, I can just say, hey, I want a live mount. And all we really told Rubrik was, build me some servers, I need some servers to test. And Rubrik was like, hey, cool, here's your servers. And that's really what I want, right? I want to do minimal effort. So to build a workflow, right, the first thing is really, what do we need to do? So in this case, I knew that we, wanted to build out the environment. We needed to build out the virtual machines that have been backed up, and then we wanted to run the tests. So this is logically what I need, right? Things to do or things to look like. And then we need to look at it from an automation perspective, right? What does this look like from a task perspective? So I'm going to need to connect to the Rubrik APIs. I need to connect to vCenter. I need to request that live mount. I probably want to put things on a different network, which means I need to change the IP addresses, and then I'm going to run the tests. And okay, that's what I need to do. And then last thing is we need to actually piece all this together, right? So then we actually wrote those pieces of code, and we picked a workflow. So in this case, Invoke Build, but there's a ton of them out there. You can use Jenkins, Fabricator, AppVeyor, whatever. So this is what it looks like really for any process. It doesn't matter what you use, this is the process that you're going to use. So you're going to stage some resources, right? you're going to connect to some APIs. You're going to build out the machines you want to test. And then step 2 is you actually do the test. All right. So a lot of people stop there, but you shouldn't, right? You should keep going and then clean up. That's important. Most importantly is, report. Did this actually even work or not? So in our example today, this is, what this workflow looks like. I need to connect to my environment. I need to request a live mount. I need to set up the network. And then if any part of that fails, just kill the workflow, because that means the workflow itself has failed, right? But if it works, then go to test. And this is where we ping or do the service validation. You can also do things like application queries. Now, if step 2 fails, keep going, because that's going to tell you something about the infrastructure. I had in my example an app and a database virtual machine. So if the app fails, I don't want to stop there and assume it's an app problem. I want to keep going and check the database and see, because, for example, if the database services aren't started or, the database isn't recoverable, that's a problem. But we want to keep going so we can determine where the issue actually lies. Now, if stage 1 fails, we can actually go ahead and go straight to step 3. Or, of course, if it works and we go to step 2, then we can just go step 2 to step 3 at that point and conduct a cleanup. And then the last thing is get your results. Invoke Build. This is a PowerShell-based build tool. So this is our Invoke Build workflow visualized. So we're going to, stage things. We're going to connect. We're going to mount. We're going to validate, right, that things are working. And then we're going to, change the network. We're going to actually do the test, right, and all of that. Now, notice that cleanup up here is kind of hanging on its own, and that's because, it's not specifically in any order, right? We can do it at any point. So the circles, these call code, whereas the squares in this case actually contain code. And then what we can do at that point is output results. And you can do this with the examples you see on the slide, right? So syslog, Grafana, something else. It doesn't really matter. What matters is at the very least you are logging, so that way you can see what is going on. So that way, somebody can troubleshoot and determine when those tests start to fail, right? And figure out why this is happening, or more importantly, who to blame, right? Who made that change, so that way we can hunt them down and figure out what went wrong. Now, we saw in the UI, right, me doing a live mount, and then we saw me doing a live mount using our APIs, right, by writing some code. I can do the same thing, right? So ultimately, you can continue to, use the UI, or you can choose to consume the APIs. The choice is yours, but it's important to know that they're both there. They both allow you to do the same things. Okay, so with that, thank you very much for your time. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about anything that we covered today.